Hello, everybody, and welcome to The View from Europe. This next Authenticate session is going to dive into some of the government policies, initiatives, and regulations in Europe that are driving adoption of identity and authentication solutions. My name's Jeremy Grant. I work as an advisor to the FIDO Alliance on public policy and government engagement. My day job is part of the cybersecurity and privacy team at Venable, a law firm out of Washington, D.C. I've had the pleasure of working with FIDO for the last 5 years or so. I'm excited about today's panel. One of the things I think we've seen in the authentication world is that government policies and government initiatives are having a major impact on whether authentication is used and how it's used. First, because new authentication solutions have to be compliant with different policies and regulations. And second, because government regulations and government initiatives can play a big role in driving adoption of new technologies. So in Europe, we've seen three major initiatives that have all had a material impact on how Europeans are using identity and authentication solutions. PSD2, the Payment Services Directive 2, focused on open banking and opening up the whole financial services ecosystem in terms of how data and payments move. eIDAS, which has been the European Union's initiative focused on interoperability of electronic IDs. And finally, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which has emerged not just as a European standard for privacy, but arguably a global standard for privacy. So the person who'll be doing most of the talking today, or the two people actually, Alain Martin from Thales and Sebasian Elfors from Yubico. Let me hand it off to Alain to start the presentation.
Thank you, Jeremy, and hello to everybody. Actually, we're going to start talking about GDPR, and then we'll move on to PSD2 and then eIDAS. And so the General Data Protection Regulation, as you know, is all about privacy, data protection of people. It's also about consent, which is a very important subject, also data subject rights. And all these are very relevant for FIDO. There's more in GDPR around adequacy of data collection and that kind of stuff, which we're not going to address today. And so to illustrate where FIDO can help with data protection, this is a very good example. This shows you the example of healthcare information that is used by both healthcare professionals and by people. People have, under GDPR, the right to access to their own personal data in order to rectify or delete and so on. And so there is this fundamental right to access. And so you see that you have two categories of people that need to access to protected information. In this example, healthcare professionals and people. Actually, I used the healthcare data with a reason. It's because under GDPR, this is defined as a special category of data. And this special category of data needs to be protected with suitable safeguards. More generally, GDPR says that the level of protection of data should be appropriate to the risk. And so here, very clearly, if this kind of information is protected by passwords, you see the potential risk that is brought by this poor technology. Under GDPR, there are very hefty fines when data is breached, and more particularly so if this is a special category of data. And so this is an excellent example of where strong customer authentication offered by FIDO can help. Another important consideration of the GDPR is this notion of privacy by design. In other words, any solution that collects or protects access to data should be, from the very design, should implement privacy and data protection from the design. This is the case with FIDO. This illustrates the number of reasons why FIDO is actually embracing this notion of privacy by design. I highlighted in yellow the notion of biometrics, because in FIDO, biometric data is never shared with servers. It's always stored locally on the customer's device and never shared. And biometrics are one of those, another example of these special categories of data that require special protection. So it's not just that. I mean, in general, FIDO does not share data, doesn't share keys. There's no passwords to share with FIDO, but it's more than that. With FIDO, you protect the web origin of requests, and so you can avoid man-in-the-middle attacks. So there are a number of protection mechanisms implemented in FIDO, which are completely in line with this notion of privacy by design. So I won't go much more than that in GDPR. Just this summary slide to say that GDPR is all about data protection measures. There are many data protection measures described in FIDO, but actually GDPR does not talk about authentication and access rights at all. It leaves it open. And so this is a good example, a good illustration of a potential problem that with GDPR, you're going to protect the data of the people that are in your system. But if you leave the access to this data protected by passwords, clearly there is a big gap. And in light of the heavy fines, our message is that generally speaking, service providers should implement strong customer authentication in order to protect access to data. So now we're going to talk about FIDO and PSD2. And just to start with, a few words on what PSD2 actually is. There's a lot of stuff on this slide. PSD2 in a nutshell is a directive, but it's transposed as a regulation in local laws. And it mandates a number of things. It mandates access to the account. In other words, banks need to open access to bank account information. And this will be typically done through open APIs. The second mandate is to strongly authenticate customers when themselves or a trusted third party or third-party provider is accessing this data on their behalf. So this is a very important aspect of PSD2, the strong customer authentication. And finally, as I just said, PSD2 introduces these new roles of third-party providers. There are two types of third-party providers, account information service providers, AISP, which you can see on the left-hand side, typically account aggregators, and payment initiation service providers that you can see on the right-hand side, which access an account in order to initiate a payment. And so all this is detailed in another regulatory document called the RTS, which means the regulatory technical standards. And so the first work we did with FIDO is to examine how FIDO complies with the requirements of the RTS. I'll go very briefly through this. The RTS describes strong customer authentication, obviously. And here, if we focus on that, the description, what is strong customer authentication is the mix of a minimum of two of authentication elements, as they're called. One of them being the possession element, and in FIDO, that would be the FIDO Authenticator. And one of the other two would be a knowledge factor, for example, a PIN under FIDO, or an inheritance factor, which would be a biometric verification, which is exactly the way FIDO works. FIDO, as you know, works with a first step where you authenticate the user to the device by means of a PIN or by means of biometric data. And then if you look at the right-hand side of this, the RTS also describe what is called an authentication code. And an authentication code is the proof that the user was authenticated. FIDO does exactly that through the challenge response mechanism. A challenge provided by a bank to the authenticator is signed by a private key inside the authenticator and produces a response, a signed response. The signed response is the authentication code described in the RTS. We did a much more detailed analysis of FIDO compliance, and as you will see at the end of this presentation, there is a white paper that describes that. A specific aspect of this authentication code, very much debated, is called dynamic linking. This is the ability to produce an authentication code that actually signs the transaction details, typically the transaction amount and the merchant identifier. FIDO can do this. You can obviously send to the authenticator a combination of a challenge and transaction information, and this will be digitally signed by the authenticator, producing an authentication code with dynamic linking. Moreover, some authenticators, especially on mobile phones, have a capability to sign what is actually displayed. What you see is what you sign, which is an excellent combination to implement dynamic linking. The other aspect of the work we did on applying FIDO to the PSD2 regulation is around the customer journey. If you look on the right-hand side of this slide, This is a typical user journey when paying, in this example, this payment initiation, where the user is going to authenticate by means of an OTP, a one-time password, by SMS, or it could be generated in a device. It's the same thing. There are minimum 3 steps to perform this because the user has to enter a password, then use the device to receive an OTP or generate an OTP, which would be a second step, and then enter manually this OTP in the adequate field. So there are minimum of 3 steps in this kind of authentication. With FIDO authentication can be one-step authentication. This is an example, but there are others where when you click on the pay button, you receive out of band a push notification that displays the transaction details, and you put your finger to authenticate and approve this payment. And that's it, you're done. More generally speaking, user experience can be greatly enhanced with FIDO through what we call platform authenticators. As you probably know, through FIDO2 and WebAuthn, FIDO authentication can be natively embedded in the platform. The platform is the device with which you interact, for example, a PC on the upper side of this slide, or the mobile phone in the lower side. And there is no need to interact with another device. That's the benefit of FIDO platform authentication. And so the user experiences in this case would be, in the example of a PC, you're on a merchant website or a third-party provider website. At the time of authentication, a window will appear that belongs to the bank. You're in the bank domain and you authenticate there, and you move back to the merchant website. And with platform authenticators, again, it can be a local PIN verification, or it can be a selfie taken by the camera of this PC, or it could be a fingerprints system that you can find now on many PCs. That's even more the case on mobile phones, where you will use a biometric modality supported by the phone in order to authenticate in a very seamless manner. Further work we've done on applying FIDO to PSD2 is looking at alternative models where there is no redirection to a bank website at all. You stay within the merchant website, and this can be handled through what is called delegated authentication, where the bank has delegated to the merchant the capabilities of authenticating the user. And when this is done with FIDO, the great benefit is the work that the FIDO Alliance has done with the Yubico organization. Yubico owns the 3D secure specification, which is a means for the merchant to communicate information to the bank for the purpose of initiating a payment and authenticating the user. And in this case, when the merchant has authenticated with a FIDO device the user, the work we did with Yubico is to be able to pass in a standardized way information about this authenticator to the bank that can add this to their risk assessment in order to avoid the disruption that would be the step-up authentication where the user would be redirected to the bank interface. And so there is a lot of interest in the market for delegated authentication. We're about to publish a paper on this subject. To finish, this is the third aspect of the work we've done in evaluating FIDO for PSD2. This highlights, let's say, the key benefits of FIDO in terms of scalability and ease of deployment. Again, the fact that it is supported in many browsers and many platforms, including now Apple devices and PCs, which is more recent. So you have a great coverage in terms of platforms, operating systems, and browsers, which greatly facilitates deployment. There are a number of off-the-shelf devices, including security keys, but not only mobile phones. Many mobile phones now come with FIDO natively supported, which provides for a mix of possible devices that a bank can use to reach to a maximum of customers in the market. That's it for me. I'll hand over to Sebasian to talk about eIDAS. Thank you.
So thank you, Alain. So what I'm going to present here is how to use FIDO together with eIDAS services. So first of all, here's an overview of the eIDAS components and how they can be applied on FIDO. So on the left-hand side, we have the electronic identification pillar, the so-called eID schemes. And they, in turn, are based on 3 layers. First of all, we have the cross-border access for EU citizens to access any public service in the EU. And that is done through so-called eIDAS nodes. And I will get back to what that means in a couple of slides. The assurance levels in EU under eIDAS are called low, substantial, and high. The levels that are applicable for FIDO are the substantial and high assurance levels. And the third layer is notification of national eID schemes by the EU Commission. So when the EU Commission has approved a national eID scheme, it can be used for cross-border access all through the European Union. On the right-hand side, we have the so-called qualified trust service providers, QTSPs. Those are centralized services that are accredited and operated under very strict controls. And the layer that is of most interest to FIDO authentication, that is signature and seal creation by QTSP service providers in the cloud. So here's how to use FIDO2 in an eID scheme under eIDAS. An eID scheme is typically based on 2 functions. It's identification, where the user is first identified properly, and then there is authentication. FIDO plays a role in the authentication space in this scheme. Then there's a third layer, authorization. The authorization are typically managed by identity and access management systems, typically based on OpenID Connect or SAML version 2. So here's an example how to use FIDO in a cross-border environment. So if you take an example that we have a service provider A in EU member state A, that could, for example, be the tax authority in Sweden. Then we have EU member state B, could, for example, be the Czech Republic, where a citizen wants to access the Swedish tax authority by using a FIDO authenticator. So what happens is that the Czech citizen requests access to the service provider in Sweden. The Swedish service provider sends a request to the eIDAS node A. eIDAS node A then redirects this identification request to eIDAS node B in the Czech Republic. The Czech citizen then authenticates by using FIDO to the identity provider in the Czech Republic. And the positive authorization is channeled back through eIDAS node B in Czech Republic to eIDAS node A in Sweden, and then finally grants access to the Swedish tax authority, which is service provider A. The other use case that we're focusing on is how to use FIDO for authentication to qualified trust service providers. In particular, we are focusing here on remote signing services, which means that the signing operation takes place at the QTSP in the cloud. So the user has a certificate, a qualified certificate that is actually deployed and operated at the qualified signature creation device at the QTSP in the cloud. So what happens is in step 1 that the user registers by using WebAuthn. In the second step, the user can now authenticate by using a FIDO authenticator to the QTSP. Step 3 means that the user uploads a document that should be signed. And in order to activate the signature mechanism at the QTSP, the user now uses WebAuthn with a signing operation, which means that the user unlocks his private key at the QSCD at the QTSP in the cloud. In step 5, the document that now is signed with a qualified signature is returned from the QTSP to the user. And here's a system overview how to show how FIDO can be deployed together with the CEN standards under eIDAS. CEN is the European Standardization Organization, and they have created a couple of standards how to deploy this in a proper way. So very quickly, the FIDO2 client is harmonized with the so-called CEN signery interface. It's essentially the same type of device. At the QTSP, which is the remote signing service in this case, there is also a FIDO2 WebAuthn relying party deployed. The WebAuthn relying party takes care of registration of the user towards the certification authority and also authentication towards the SEN SSA, which stands for Sign Server Application. The FIDO Authentication can now be used by the so-called SEN Signature Authentication module that is residing in the HSM, and that in turn unlocks the private key which is hosted in the QSED in the HSM. So here we have a very strong authentication going all the way from the FIDO Authenticator on the left-hand side all the way to the eIDAS QSED on the right-hand side. And finally, we have some good news on FIDO for eIDAS. First of all, FIDO Alliance has submitted feedback to the eIDAS Inception Impact Assessment document in September this year. So in a nutshell, we are promoting eID schemes to be under level of assurance high. And that's something that FIDO can implement and meet. We also believe that an extension of eIDAS to the private sector that would be very well received by a number of companies in the European Union. And we're also promoting new options for creating digital versions of physical identity documents. That is, of course, very important during remote enrollment processes, in particular during situations such as the COVID-19 situation that we're having. We also believe that mutual recognition and reuse of pre-approved eID products could be of great interest. That would mean that if you have a FIDO authenticator that's pre-approved in one country, it should be able to reuse in another EU member state. The other good news is that the Czech DNS register CZ.NIC, they have now deployed national eID schemes that are based on FIDO, also in September this year. So the Czech CZ.NIC, their eID scheme is now officially accredited as a national eID scheme by the Czech authorities. It's implemented in Moje ID, which is an identity provider in the Czech Republic that is used by 700,000 citizens. The level of assurance is set to substantial, but they are working on getting it accredited on level high as well. And finally, here are the white papers that the FIDO Alliance has published under the EU regulations. So if you're interested, please visit any of these links and download the material that are of interest to you.
So now if you have any questions, this is a good time to answer them. Please let us know. Thank you.